Good afternoon and welcome to day 4 of Central Arkansas Library System Six Bridges Book Festival. I hope that everyone's having a great time zooming in and listening and reading and meeting all these wonderful authors. Today, I am the moderator for the session. My name is Garbo Hearne, and I'm excited to welcome Marie Benedict as we discuss her book with author Victoria Christopher Murray, which I have to say, I hate to say it, but Victoria will not be with us today, but I am sure that Marie can carry this story and we will have a great conversation. So welcome, Marie.
Thank you so much.
We are talking about The Personal Librarian, which is the story of Belle Marion Greener, known as Belle Costa Green. And you'll hear me saying Belle de Costa Green the whole day because I just love her name. But before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors for this session, which is the Arkansas State Library and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And Marie, you are zooming in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right?
I am.
And just a short introduction because we have a lot to talk about in an intriguing book. You are a New York, and she is a New York Times bestselling author known for historical fiction about important women in history. Her co-author, Victoria Christopher Murray, is also an acclaimed author with 1 million books in print and is known for her outstanding fiction regarding the African American experience. Their collaboration has produced a intriguing, wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, then you must, and I encourage you to go to Wordsworth and pick it up because they are the official bookseller. So now that we've got all that out of the way, Marie, the first question to get you started, how did you find Belle de Costa Green and decide to make her your next subject?
Oh my gosh, that is such a good question. But before I start, can I say thank you? Thank you for having me here to the festival. Thank you for moderating, Garbo. We got to meet before when Victoria and I were on tour, and I just loved talking with you and seeing your store. And thank you to librarians everywhere who are making this possible. I know it's in partnership with some of the libraries. If you are familiar with the Personal Librarian or any of my books, you know I'm like a huge history nerd. So for me, this is just such an honor and a treat. So thank you. So the Personal Librarian. Okay, so Belle de Costa Green, or Belle Marion Greener, she was really both. And in fact, if you look at the dedication page of the book, Victoria and I chose to dedicate the book to Belle Marion Greener and Belle de Costa Green because they are really the two different sides of Belle. They are the two different sides of the tightrope upon which she walked during her life. I actually found Belle de Costa Green, Belle Marion Greener, decades ago. I don't want to age myself, so I'm not going to say exactly when, but I was, for a long time, I was a New York City commercial litigator. I worked at huge New York City law firms. I knew it wasn't my calling. I had been a lover of history. I was a history major in college. I was always fascinated with sort of these untold pieces of history and women's voices. And I thought when I went to college that I'd be like a historian or an archaeologist or something. And I kind of got waylaid along the way and ended up as a lawyer, as a lot of people who are history majors do. And I tell you all this, not to bore you about my life, but because it's pertinent for the story. It's important because it was because of my feeling that I was called to do something else that I started to visit the cultural institutions of New York City. So I was around 3 or 4 o'clock, maybe 1 or 2 days a month, I would sneak out from work and I would visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art and a variety of other places. And I say sneak out at 4 o'clock because I really worked like 14-hour days, most days. And so for me to actually do anything while things were open, I had to kind of dart out of the office at 3 or 4, and then I would come back and work late into the night. And one of my favorite places to go is someplace that I know Garbo just went, and that is the Morgan Library, which of course is the primary setting of the book. I would and I mean, Garbo, I don't know if you're on the screen or not, but you can nod if you agree. Is it not like one of the most beautiful libraries you've ever been to? I mean, it's hard for me to capture in words, right? How magnificent this place is. It's really only for the old original buildings, really only 4 rooms, but it's rooms the size of like I don't know, a theater, right? JP Morgan's study, Bell's office, the library proper, and the rotunda, which is this beautiful kind of welcoming room. And I was touring through the library, and I had gone many times before, but on this one particular day, a docent who had been giving a tour to some people, or maybe a curator, I don't know who this person is, and I'm so indebted to her. It's unfortunate, but we started talking about the museum, and she mentioned to me that this beautiful library, beautiful not just instruction, but beautiful in what it contained, which were this collection of rare and priceless manuscripts, really one of the world's best collections. That this library's collection was not built by JP Morgan alone, but he had a librarian, a personal librarian that helped him build it. And she told me her name, Belle DaCosta Green. And I just remember hearing this and just thinking, I wasn't even writing books at this time. I was still a lawyer. I was dabbling a little bit in ideas. But I remember thinking at this time how remarkable it was, right? That this, at a time period, we're talking early 1900s, a time period when women did not even have the right to vote. JP Morgan had a right-hand person who was a woman who became one of the most powerful people in the art world, certainly responsible for creating the collection at the Morgan Library, but so much more than that. She became an influencer, to use a much more modern word, an expert, really around the world. And I just remember thinking how remarkable Belle DaCosta Green must have been. And I keep sort of a running list of women that I'd like to write about. And she has been on that list for literally decades. I stopped working as a lawyer over 15 years ago. I practiced for over 10 years. And it was sort of midway through my tenure as a lawyer that I kind of found her. Do you want me to start talking about like what I found out about her over time, or do you want me to tap into another topic right now?
I want you to jump into your experiences, and you found out how she pulled this off. I mean, what did you find out about passing? Because I saw her picture and she didn't look white to me at all.
Oh, that's what Victoria always says. I mean,
so
she posted and when we first started this project, and I'll back up into that in a second, one of the pictures of Belle. And that was the uniform reaction that she got. I will say, depending on the picture, it's a little bit murkier in some versus the other. So it's hard to tell. But at first, of course, I just thought I didn't know any of that about Belle. And in fact, most people didn't know that about Belle. Belle lived her entire life her entire life as JP Morgan's personal librarian as a white woman. And she very carefully kept that identity intact. Through her death, she burned all of her personal correspondence. Victoria and I think, because she wanted to keep that identity intact. I think she was worried that some of her correspondence might give her identity away. But when I first learned about Belle, there wasn't that much even really known about her. I think there was one biography written about her it was in a scholarly publication. When I first started looking at her, there was mention of the rumors about her, right? Rumors that had swirled about her identity, really even during her lifetime, but they were all just rumors. And as soon as JP Morgan embraced her, all questions, real questions to her identity were completely put to rest, right? If JP Morgan said you were white, you were white.
So the name, the Costa, the Portuguese grandmothers, talk about that.
So what I was going to talk about next was when I started to learn her real story.
Okay.
A couple decades, as I continued kind of thinking about Belle and researching her, more started to come out. And there was a biography of JP Morgan, that came out, in which the link between Belle and her father became known. And this was really the thing that Belle tried to avoid during most of her life. The one thing she couldn't let people know was who her father was. Her father, because it would make clear her real identity. Her father was famous in his lifetime, a well-known man, Richard T. Greener. He was the first African-American graduate of Harvard. But he was so much more than that. I mean, he became during his lifetime a powerful orator, a powerful advocate for equality in the years after the Civil War. In that role, he was the first African-American professor of the University of South Carolina. He then went on to get a law degree and became a dean of Howard Law School. And all the while, he's traveling around the country, interacting with some figures that remain more known today, I think, like Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. But he, in his day, was really well known. And this is the man that raised Belle. And her mother came from this wonderful, rich heritage. She was part of the Fleet family. They were a family, they were part of a community, a free community of, I can't even talk today, free community of color in Washington, D.C. that had been free for generations. And they were well-educated, affluent professionals in this community. And she had lived in that community with her mother's family for almost 10 years before she moved to New York City. So when she was growing up, she was raised steeped in the language of equality and raised really in the bosom of a very cultured, wonderful, rich heritage as part of this free community of color. And it was when they went to New York City as part of her father's work, he became the head of a committee to create a statue to Ulysses S. Grant in New York City, that the idea of passing began. Her mother was 100% on board with her father when they were first married in this sort of fight for equality. As the years progressed and Reconstruction started to fade and segregation became more prominent in reaction to the promise of equality, her mother started to see that that segregation was going to be the law of the land, and she started to fear for her children. And when they came to New York City, without even trying, they were passing. There was a big influx of immigrants from a variety of Mediterranean countries at that time. And the entire Greener Fleet family were very fair, and they actually in many ways looked similar in complexion to these Mediterranean immigrants. And that's what people assumed they were. And so bit by bit over time, against her father's wishes, Belle's mother decided to have her children pass. First, they lived in a white neighborhood. Then they started to go to white schools, bit by bit. And once they really made the transition over to pass entirely as white, a decision which actually split her parents up permanently, because her father could not condone that. That's the time at which her mother changed the family name. They all changed their name from Greener to Green, because they needed to have that distance from Richard T. Greener, because he was so well known. And for Belle and her brother, Russell, the mother added the middle name, or kind of two-part last name, of DaCosta. And the reason she did that was her explanation for the fact that Russell and Belle were slightly darker in complexion. That was a nod to the invented background that she gave them. She told them that if anyone asked, they were to say they were Portuguese. And that's sort of how Belle Marion Greener became Belle DaCosta Green.
So moving into writing this book with Victoria Christopher Murray, why was she so important to get this story told correctly?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think I mentioned that Belle had been on my list for like a super long time. Even when I started switching my career entirely to writing about historical women who left really an important legacy, and women who were dealing with issues that were both historic and modern. And I over the years, I kind of collected information about Belle. More and more became known about Belle. There's a wonderful, in I think 2007, a wonderful biography about Belle came out, really the only one that really authoritative one. It's called An Illuminated Life by Heidi Artizoni. But I knew that it was neither appropriate or right for me to try and write the book by myself. I knew I needed and wanted to have an author of color write it with me. I felt Belle deserved that. She deserved to have her story told by an African-American woman like herself. And I also knew that, as a writer of fiction, I can imagine a lot of different things. I've imagined myself back in the 5th century. I've imagined myself coming from a variety of different backgrounds or my characters, but I really can't begin to imagine what it's like to be an African-American woman in our society, then or now. And early on, I decided that I wanted to find a partner to write the story with me. And it had been on my mind for a while. I was still writing a book a year, so it was in my mind, but it wasn't at the forefront. And then I read a wonderful book by Victoria's, which I know you've read, Garbo, Stand Your Ground. And for anyone who's not familiar with it, it's such a powerful story. It takes this terrible epidemic in our country of the shooting of young Black men. And it explores this issue through this narrative, this dual narrative, looking at his death from the perspective of his mother and also the white wife of the police officer who shot him. And this book, I found it so moving and so important. And I loved her writing, all the things you would normally think of, but she was doing something else in this book that really spoke to me. And it was that she was looking at an issue from the perspective of the women. And she was looking at the issue from the perspective of the African-American and the white experience. And I thought, oh my gosh, in some ways, Victoria is interested in a lot of the same things that I am as well, exploring these really difficult topics from the woman's perspective, which is not always how it's often not how it's done, right? When I look at the past, I'm trying to look at it through a new lens. And I really felt like that's what Victoria was doing as well. So at that point, I had an outline and probably a short treatment of the book, maybe a couple chapters written. And through our agents, I reached out to Victoria. Now, normally she takes over this part of the story, but we've told it many, many times by now. So I think she'd be okay with me saying that she got it. And she looked at that. She couldn't even get past the JP Morgan. Victoria is a very gifted writer of contemporary fiction. And she got this treatment about, and again, it's really my fault for not leading with Belle and leading with her identity. But I love when I present a topic to kind of set the stage from the perspective we think we know, and then to put the real players in there. But anyway, she couldn't get past the fact that JP Morgan was a character. She did not find that interesting. She wasn't grabbed by my introduction. And her agent kept nagging her. We're talking, Victoria likes to say it's only 2 months, but I think it was more like 3 or 4 months. It could have even been longer. By the point I finally heard back through my agent from her agent, I had honestly assumed she didn't want to write it with me. I really did, because it had been such a long time. And what she tells me is once her agent finally nagged her enough into doing it, and she got to the part about Belle, she was in. She didn't even really need to get too deep into the details. But of course we then had to meet and see if we thought we could make it work. And without getting too weird and odd and mystical about it, we just connected right from the start. It's really, it's really unique the way our relationship is so strong and so special. And it definitely evolved over time. But even from the very beginning, we felt this deep connection to one another. We are very similar in so many ways. And we both came to writing from a professional career. I was a lawyer. She was a businesswoman. We approach things very often in the same way. And we both felt this strong pull to tell Belle's story. And I felt like we just knew we could do it. Now, Victoria, of course, had co-written books before, thank goodness, because I really didn't know what I was doing. And I was a little bit crazy to think I could we had never met. I thought she would be good from writing her book, but she might not want to write a book with me, But I'm so thankful that that she agreed and we started on this journey together.
The process looks, the way the book is written, it seems like it's written in one voice. It doesn't seem like you wrote one chapter, she wrote one chapter. How did that work? Because it melds together so well.
That is such a compliment. I mean, that was our goal, right? We write. The other kind of interesting thing about Victoria and I both is that we both almost always write in the first person.
Okay.
And that's pretty unusual. Not a lot of writers choose that, especially not in the historical fiction category, but she and I both feel like a connection to our characters that way. So, and it was so important, of course, since we were going to be writing in one voice in the first person, that we have this seamless continuity in presentation. So I would say like we had our process kind of it was in two stages. The first stage, it was the building blocks of the story in that very first draft that we turned into our agent or editor, excuse me. And the approach that we used in some ways was similar to what I had done before with historical fiction in terms of creating timelines, doing the research, getting kind of the bones of the story together. But then when we actually sat down to talk about how the book would evolve, we together talked through each and every chapter, what it would look like, how it would look, how it would tie into the next story, and then how it would tie into the overarching arc of the book and the themes we were trying to get at. And then, I know now I've talked to other people who've co-written books, but some people, it's alternating chapters or I'll take these. Honestly, we decided who would write the first draft of a chapter based on interest. Sometimes it would be a very heavily, a book that was very heavy in the history, and I would generally take that because that's what I love. Victoria might feel a certain she has always been a daddy's girl, and she would not mind me saying that, so I'm going to say it. Okay. And our character Belle was very much a daddy's girl, and so that would be something that she would feel very strongly she wanted to craft because that connection was so important to the story. So it kind of happened very organically who would take the first kind of attempt at a chapter. But once each of us had taken that attempt, we would then pass them back to each other, and the other person would edit, add. So really each chapter had our conversations. It had one of us writing it. It had another one of us writing it, and then we edited it. So it's such a compliment you say that it's seamless because in many ways it passed between both of us so many times before we released it that it really was a joint effort between us. But that was really the first stage of the process, which really led to the submission of our initial big draft, which we had edited, of course, to our editor around December or January of 2019, 2020. We got our edits back. And that first edit is really the biggest one you're going to do. You get your biggest bulk of comments, structure, details, all that sort of stuff. We got that back only a few weeks before the pandemic shut down. And suddenly, everything around us was changing. We were at home, literally at home all the time. And for the first time, Victoria and I were really using Zoom like the rest of us were, right? So instead of meeting or talking on the phone or however we were working through our writing process, we were like this every day talking. And I sometimes joke that I feel like Victoria was in my house with me during the shutdown because she and I spent so much time on Zoom. It was like my kids, my husband, and Victoria. We were all here together. And that was so important because suddenly we went from, handling this more professionally to just checking in with each other every day. How are you doing? Are you all right? What's going on? And then, of course, all the social unrest unfolded in our world. And the historic racism that we were talking about and writing about suddenly became very present, modern day racism all around us. Not that racism hadn't existed before, but it was just right there.
Mhm.
And we were processing it together. And while we had certainly talked about race before, we had talked about, it had mostly been focused on from a historical perspective. And suddenly we were talking about Victoria's own experiences as an African-American woman, the things she deals with daily, the things she's dealt with over the course of her life, and then her own family, her parents who were fighters in the civil rights movement, her grandmother and grandfather, who passed for convenience if they had to. They were fair enough, and sometimes the situation required it. So suddenly we were having these very honest, sometimes difficult, frank conversations about race. And we became, and we still are, very, very close. But all of that, I think, worked its way into the pages of that second draft. And I think it brought while we're still historic, I think it made all of those issues very, very immediate.
I think you were able to put classism, racism, sexism, romance, intrigue. I mean, where did fiction start? What was true, what wasn't true? It's very intriguing. So it makes all of us want to know more about her. But we have a question from Chris, and you answered some of it. He said he has two questions.
Sure.
Is it easier or more challenging to write about an actual person in time and history as opposed to writing fiction? And secondly, understanding why you partnered with Victoria. Is it difficult to collaborate and co-author a book versus writing a standalone composition?
Oh, two great questions. Let's start with the second one first, if that's okay. I have to say, writing this book with Victoria was the best writing experience of my life, hands down. And I often say that I'm so happy that people have responded to Belle's story and really been moved by our book. And that's so important to me. But for me personally, the most important thing has been my friendship with Victoria. So I mean, I can't really even compare this experience to the experience I have writing other books. It's just so singular. Now, that said, of course, we are writing more books together. So hopefully it'll just be magic again for us. But there's just something about writing these books with her, which is just so special. What was this first question again? I'm sorry. It was about, was it fact versus fiction? No, it was about, real women, real women.
Right.
That's such a good question. So I have written about both, from a historical perspective. I mostly write all historical focused. Is it easier to write about a real person versus someone I've conjured up in my imagination? For me, no, it's easier. I connect more with the real, authentic historical figures. It can be harder, certainly. I mean, because, with all of the women I write about, you're dealing with somebody who really lived, right? And you're dealing with somebody who may have left behind letters and journals and family, and whose life has reverberated into the present in a really meaningful way. And I really look at these women as my heroes, right? I want to honor and respect them and their lives and their contributions. So there's certainly a greater responsibility to the character because they really did live. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this is almost their second chance at an existence. But I feel so connected to them. It's almost hard for me now to write a character that I've just conjured up in my imagination. Not that sometimes I don't add those characters in my books, sometimes, like in the Personal Librarian, we chose in part of the book, you'll see Belle was, just for me to back up a second, she was like a celebrity in her own day, right? She hobnobbed with the Vanderbilts and all the upper, they call them the upper 100, the luminaries of society and the financial world. But she was friendly with famous entertainers, and she also was friendly with the more bohemian set, the women who were fighting for voting rights, stuff like that. So as just one example, in the Personal Librarian, we have two women that are really an amalgamation of a variety of her friends that we created to represent those people. And they are fictional characters that really are stand-ins for a bunch of other people. I don't feel as connected to them as I do to, say, Anne Morgan, who's a really important secondary character in the story. J.P. Morgan's daughter, who had a very kind of tension-ridden relationship with Belle. I feel really connected to her, and I can't say for certain it's because she existed. But I do think that's part of it. For me, it's so important to bring these women out from the shadows.
Okay. Believe it or not, it's 4:00. We've been talking for an hour, and all of the things that we needed to talk about, we haven't done. But the last question is coming from Susan, who says, who else is on your list?
Oh my gosh. Can I talk about Victorianize, the next book we're doing?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So that's what I'm in right now. So, and if I would let you see the big mess of a pile that's back here, you would see it. But our next book right now is called The First Ladies. And it is the story of the friendship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune. And for those of you who don't know about how these two women knew each other, obviously Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of she was the wife of FDR, and she was an activist for equality in her own right, for women, working women, all sorts of people and backgrounds. And Mary McLeod Bethune, of course, was phenomenal. She created Bethune College. She became, during the 1930s, 40s, into the 30s and 40s, I'd say it was her biggest time in really becoming this force on a national basis in terms of running national organizations that advocated for the African-American community. And then ultimately became the first African-American woman in the cabinet, in the presidential cabinet, among many other accomplishments. But these two women met actually in the 1920s, before Eleanor was the first lady. And while Mary was kind of on the rise in the national horizon, and they formed this really close bond, a bond that was very legitimate, but that they also used as a sort of another way to advocate for equality. Behind the scenes and in front of the scenes together, they helped push forward really the beginnings of a lot of civil rights legislation, some of which they just did themselves, some of which they pushed FDR to do. And they used themselves and their very real and close friendship as a symbol. People, of course, did not like to see a Black and a white woman together as friends during that time period. This was the era of Jim Crow laws. And Mary and Eleanor would invite each other to their houses, Eleanor would make sure press was there, and they would see each other going into the houses and having meals together. And so they became a really important force for equality, which I don't think, people know separately they've done stuff, but the impact of each other, and Mary in particular on Eleanor. So Victoria and I are so excited to explore the nature of their friendship, because for us, in many ways, it's almost autobiographical. It's a chance to explore our own friendship, the ways we kind of overcame our own discomfort in talking about race and uncomfortable things, to really being able to talk about absolutely anything, and hopefully use their friendship as a model for allyship and for change. So, and it's something, it's interesting, as we're deep in the research right now, there's very little written about the two of them together. And so it's really a unique experience for us to kind of foray into this part of their lives, which for as much as both women have been written about over time, this has not been written about very much. And so we're really excited about it. And of course, it's an excuse for us to be together, which we enjoy.
Well, guess what? We do have 30 more minutes. You and I have been talking for an hour. The audience, we started at 2:30, so I'm trying to.
Okay.
So we got plenty of time. We got plenty of time.
Good.
So we have a question for Felicia.
Sure.
When did the Morgan family members as a whole find out that Belle was passing?
Well, that's a great question. I don't even know if I've ever been asked that question before. I would say I haven't talked to any Morgan family members right now, but I would say they definitely didn't know during their lifetimes. What I would say is that the way Belle was, um, was introduced to JP Morgan, the Morgan family, is really critical. So if you don't mind, I'll go back in time for a minute. Belle, once, I think I mentioned that her mother kind of decided that all the children would pass, and they went to white schools, and they worked in jobs that would normally only be for white people. Belle, unlike her mother, wanted her to become a teacher, but like her father, who loved rare books and artwork, and at one point was a librarian, she really wanted to be a librarian. And she, through a variety of positions, she eventually ended up as a Princeton University librarian. Princeton University during this time period in the 19 teens, 20s, it was probably the most segregated of the Ivy Leagues. Some of the other ones were beginning to admit students of color, but not Princeton. And so she kind of rose up in her position at Princeton University Library. She became somewhat expertise in rare manuscripts. She met in that role Junius Morgan, who was JP's nephew. He was there kind of working in a trustee capacity. He helped advise JP on rare and priceless manuscripts. That was the role he held with his uncle. And he and Belle became very friendly in a professional way over these books. And he suggested to his uncle that Belle DeCosta Green might be a suitable personal librarian for him. He was looking for someone to help him run the Morgan Library. When Junius knew Belle, the fact that she was working at the Princeton University Library automatically meant, at least in his mind, that she was white. It was such a segregated institution that it wouldn't have even occurred to him, I don't think, that an African-American woman would be working in that capacity. So when he introduced Belle to JP, it would have been as a white woman. No matter what JP thought, he would have accepted that, I think. Victoria and I do not believe that if JP really thought that Belle was African-American, that he would have hired her. Now, once she was installed in the position as personal librarian to JP Morgan, part of her job meant that she had to go out to all these social occasions, because one of the ways she found books that she wanted to collect was by knowing other rich collectors and people in sort of these elite roles. So she had to be out and about as his personal librarian. During this time period, there were rumors about her identity. There were rumors that maybe there was something else going on. But at no point during this time, from what we've been able to find, did JP raise the bell about that. And the fact that as time went on, he continued to embrace her, continued to give her more and more power, more and more money to use. It was like a stamp of approval for larger society. I mean, he was one of the most powerful men in the world at this time period. So, and I think in the decades that passed after that, where she continued to run the library under JP's son, Jack, and then even after Jack died, she continued on as director of the library. The Morgan family may have had their own suspicions, but nobody had confirmation. And so I think because nobody could make that connection between Belle and Richard T. Greener. And so I think people allowed things to continue as JP had put them in place. Now, obviously, now I haven't spoken to any members of the Morgan family. Obviously, now they know. But I don't think, or we don't think during Belle's lifetime that it's something that would have come up.
It's nice that you mentioned that, because biographies, even fictional, sometimes have pushback from family. Does Belle have any living descendants, nieces or nephews? Was there any pushback from the estate? And again, the Morgans, how are they feeling?
We haven't heard anything from the Morgan family specifically, but I will say that the Morgan Library, and the Morgan family is still involved in the Morgan Library, even though it is a public library, they have absolutely embraced our story. They have embraced our book. They have embraced the role of Belle. I can't help but think that the reaction of a larger community to Belle isn't giving them sort of encouragement to put Belle back into the story, back into the museum where she belongs. You know, you and I were talking before we went on today that Belle's JP Morgan's study, which is gorgeous. It's hard to even describe to people, right? I mean, it's like lined with handmade red silk wallpaper. There's Renaissance masterpieces on the wall, priceless books, a fireplace that's so big, 5 people could stand in it. His room, his study is intact. It's exactly the way that he left it, perfectly preserved. Belle's office, which is also gorgeous. I mean, we're talking like 3 stories, you know, there's a second level that you can walk around. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. Flemish tapestry on the wall. Hers is a gallery, right? They have cabinets with that display, which is fine. But I think in many ways, Belle needs to be back. We need to see her desk and her, because she was so instrumental to that institution. We need to see her room intact as well. So that's a long-winded explanation to your question about the Morgans. As far as Belle's family goes, it's so interesting. So Belle was one originally of 7. 2 of her siblings passed away in infancy. But of her siblings that lived to adulthood, her 2 older sisters, we don't think, I can't say for sure, I'm not a genealogist, but we haven't seen that they had children of their own. One married late. The other had a hysterectomy, relatively young. So we don't know anything about those descendants. Her brother Russell did marry. He lived as a white engineer in a white community. They all married white spouses. I have not been able to find out whether he had children. I haven't seen that. I would love to see that. The youngest sister, Teddy, who was the fairest of all of her siblings, she was actually blonde. She married before World War I. Her husband died during World War I, but she had a child by that marriage. It was a boy by the name of Bobby. And one of the things that we had a whole section on in the book, and we had to remove it because it didn't fit with the timeline, was there was a time period when Teddy remarried, and I'll talk about that in a second. But when Teddy remarried, Belle and her mother adopted Bobby and raised him as you know, it was still known that he was her niece, or nephew, excuse me, but they raised him. And he was fair enough, obviously, to pass. But Teddy married again, another white man, and had a daughter. She named her daughter Belle DaCosta Green. And from what I can tell in the records, she did marry, but I haven't been able to see if she had any children. I haven't seen. And again, I'm not a genealogist. That's not my expertise. But so I haven't seen any immediate descendants that would have had a reaction. And in fact, if there are family members of Teddy's second child, they may not know about their connection to Belle DaCosta Green. If they've been living as white, they certainly might not know about their connection to Richard T. Greener. You know, so one of the things that Victoria and I thought was really important to explore in our book are the terrible sacrifices of passing. Disconnecting yourself from your family, which is what a lot of people did and had to do. You couldn't be in the company of your extended family because that would reveal your secret, right? So it's possible that a lot of the family members of Belle don't really know what happened to her, right? Because they were disconnected from. And I think that was one of the hardest things for the family was. For Belle was the fact that, they had a really tight connection with Genevieve Fleet, her mother's family in Washington, D.C. But that was not something that they could foster once they made that decision to pass. And Belle in particular, she believed she could not have children. She was very concerned that if she had children, her children, it would reveal the fact that she was not white. And so that was an enormous sacrifice that she had to make. So, whether or not Belle's extended family, how they feel about the book, they may not even know that they're related to her, depending on which side of the family they fall in, So I don't know. I don't know how they'd feel. I hope, I think about how families would feel about my books a lot. And I hope that anyone who reads any of my books would see the fact that even though I don't portray the women as perfect, because none of us are perfect, right? And sometimes our flaws are the things that make us great and make us leave these important legacies. I hope that they would see that they're my way of honoring these women. I really do.
That being said, Felicia has another question.
Sure.
She wants to know, is there a specific fictional event in the story that was used to create intrigue?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like maybe Felicia is guessing at what it is. So one of the things, a lot of times I get asked about the fact versus fiction thing, because we do write fiction, right? I mean, it's very heavily anchored in the facts and the research, the way I like to describe it, which I don't know if this even makes sense, but it makes sense to me, is that the research is the architecture of the story. It's the foundation, the pillars, the roof, but there's always going to be little gaps in between those pillars where we don't, the shadows of history, where we really don't know what happened. And that's where the fiction comes in. But it's not fiction that's just willy-nilly. It's fiction that's, as far as we can make it, anchored to the truth, anchored to the themes, anchored to the research, a logical extrapolation. Now, that said, sometimes you have to add something for the story, for the suspense. And sometimes, as if Victoria were here, she'd be laughing with me, but sometimes you just have to do it for yourselves. So without giving too much away, Garbo, you asked me earlier, there is a relationship in the story, right? Mm-hmm. So I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler for people who haven't read it, but Belle has a very deep romantic relationship with someone who works in the art world with her, Bernard Berenson. He's a real person. He's really known as like kind of the father of, or one of the key scholars in the resurgence of Renaissance artwork and the appreciation of it. He's a very famous art historian. And he was during her lifetime as well. And they had a love affair. In fact, I think Victoria and I both believe that they were kind of the love of each other's lives. Now, that's of course notwithstanding the fact that he was married, right? I mean, his wife knew about the relationship. She was fine with it. It was not a puritanical time, at least not the way we think of it. But in any event, things transpired, which I don't want to give away, during the course of this relationship. And sometimes Victoria and I were not thrilled with the way that Bernard treated Belle. So their relationship as friends, colleagues, whatever, extended for a very long period of time. But we do add a scene in there. I don't want to say exactly what it is in case people haven't read it, but it in some ways it signals sort of an endpoint in their relationship, and it's very dramatic. And that is probably the one for people who read it. When you get to that scene, you'll know it. It's a scene which Victoria and I wrote purely from our imaginations and purely from our own frustration with Bernard and our desire to exact like punishment upon him. So sometimes you just get to do that as a writer of fiction.
Okay. That being said, Matt has a question, another question. He wants to know if you will share with us a few of the books that have been most meaningful and influential to you over the years. Are they fiction or are they true?
I have to say there's one book, I talk about it a lot, so apologies if you've heard me talk about it, Garbo, but there's one book that really, let me back up a second. So, what I do is I kind of, when I'm writing about these women, I kind of sift through all the facts of their life and pull together the narrative threads and sort of look at the cause and effect. How did they become these women, right? What were the things that led to it? And if I were to look back in my own life and see, how did I end up as a writer? How did I end up as a writer specifically of these books? Because I wasn't somebody who ever like really aspired to be a writer. Like some people, a lot of writers actually, if you ask them, they'll say, oh, I always wanted to write books. That was always my dream. That was never my dream. I was a huge, crazy, voracious reader, but I think I never thought I could be a writer, right? That was something that I just couldn't envision. I could never be that good. But looking back, there is one book that put me on the path over the decades to write these stories. And that is actually a work of fantasy. It's by Marion Zimmer Bradley. And the book is called The Mists of Avalon. Most people have never heard of it. I read it. I had this wonderful aunt who was an English professor and a poet, and she was a nun, and she would always be giving me these books that shaped me in ways I didn't really understand at the time. But this book was really revolutionary for the time that it was written and the time that I read it. And it was a groundbreaking retelling of the Arthurian legend from the perspective of the women. So instead of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, we had Arthur's wife and his sister, Morgan Le Fay, who was a power in her own right. And suddenly the story that I thought I knew, that I had told, which is kind of history, kind of legend, was completely transformed by the fact that it was told from the perspective of the women. And that book was really like an awakening for me. And this, I think I read it in like middle school or high school. I can't remember exactly. But reading that book, I thought to myself, oh my God, like we are being told such a tiny piece of the past. And I started to ask myself the question, who decides what history is? Mm-hmm. Who's making the decisions about what should or shouldn't be part of it? Who's the storyteller? And how different it really is from what we're being told. And this was a time period when this was not part of the conversation, right? It was this particular book that started me on this thought process. And it's actually that book that started me off on the path of becoming a history major in college, considering a career as a history professor and archaeologist, because I wanted to get at these other voices, at the other truth. So if I were to pick one book, it's not the best book I've ever read. It's not the greatest piece of literature that I've ever read. But for me personally, it's the most transformative book because it literally started me in a way of thinking and on a path that I digressed from for many years as a lawyer. But when I was thinking about what my calling is, I went right back on the path that I had started on with that particular book. And it's that book I always use as an example when I tell people how important one book can be to the course of your life. You may not realize it at first, but it's there.
What about Victoria? Did she ever mention anybody that influenced her when you were talking?
She has a lot of people that she loves. Some poems that really meant a tremendous amount to her. I don't know if I've ever heard her talk about one particular book. There's some books, childhood books that really spoke to her, some poems that really spoke to her. I think, I mean, I don't want to speak for her, but I don't know that I've ever heard her say there's this book X is the one that put me on this path. But certainly she is somebody who from a very young age wanted to write books. In fact, she tells a really funny story about when she was, I think in third grade, I may have that wrong, and she'll probably punish me for that. But I think she actually wrote a play when she was in elementary school. And it was an amalgamation of like all the fables. It was like a little bit, the Three Little Pigs, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but it sounds so inventive and adorable. And her elementary school teacher decided that the entire elementary school would put it on as a play, and they did. So, for her, she's been on this creative path, I feel like, for a long time, a really long time. For me, I don't know that I wonder if I would have been on it, but for the Mists of Avalon.
Okay. So here's another question regarding Belle. Even though she hid her true identity, did her heritage ever come out in her acquisitions? Did she fight for classics by authors of color? In your research, did you find anything?
That is such a good question. One thing I can say for sure, and it's a story that Victoria and I usually tell together. The very first time I had been to the Morgan Library many times, as I mentioned, the very first time Victoria went, and the first time that we went together, we've been there together since. This was many months before the pandemic. We were strolling through it, and Garbo, you and I were talking a little bit before about how once you're in the space, you can imagine all the characters there, right? You can imagine Morgan in one room, you can imagine Belle in the other. And we were, as I mentioned, JP Morgan's study is in exactly the same shape as it was when he was alive. And as we're strolling through it, and we're kind of envisioning certain scenes, she's standing behind JP's desk, the kind of play acting at JP. And I'm like, okay, and Belle would be over here. And how does this feel and look? And what's the, it gives you all those details, right? That make it come alive. What does the desk look like? What is all that stuff? All of a sudden, she just stops and she's staring and she's immobile. And I went over to her, I said, are you okay? And she said, there's a portrait of a Black man on the wall. Mm-hmm. And I said, what are you talking about? Because if you go into that room and you look around, it's mostly Renaissance artwork of like Madonnas and children, right? And Jesus or saints, stuff like that. And she pointed to this big portrait that is, JP Morgan's desk is enormous. So if here's my desk, there's a painting here, and then there's another there's a painting right here. And I look over, and here's this painting that I've passed many times before, but it never struck me as being a Black man, because we only see what we think is there, right? We only see what we expect to see, kind of like Belle. People expected to see a white woman, and that's what they saw. So I looked at that painting, and as I looked at it, I realized it was a Black man. There was a portrait, a beautiful portrait from the 1600s, mm-hmm. directly behind his desk. And we were just struck by it. And so right there and then we started to do research on it in the museum itself. And we learned that its title at one point had been Portrait of a Moor. Of course, the Moors were Spanish. They were the Spanish ruling class in certain time periods in Spain. And a lot of them were of African descent, Arabic African descent. And this man who I had looked at and never seen before. And as we looked into it, we learned that it had been acquired by Jack Morgan, not JP Morgan, at Belle's suggestion. Uh-huh. And as we looked more and more at it, it looked so much like her father. It looked so much like Belle DeCosta Green's father. So to answer the fabulous question about whether or not Belle was particularly focused on acquiring African-American literature, I can, or collecting things related. I can't say for sure on that, but what I can say, I don't know this for a fact. There's no letter that tells me this, but Victoria and I do believe that portrait is like her paying homage to her father, mm-hmm. Right beneath the nose of everybody else.
I agree.
Right.
I was there a couple of days ago, and I know exactly what painting you're talking about. That I have to say, if you haven't read this book, you must read this book. And if you're ever in New York, you got to go to that library, because it's a hidden gem on Madison Avenue that most people, I think that when you come to New York, do you think about JP Morgan? Probably not. But after reading your book, it's got to be on everybody's list. If you ever go to New York, you got to go there. So
thank you so much. And thank you for visiting it and seeing all. Oh, it's just, as you and I were talking earlier, it's almost like it's hard for me to convey how magnificent it is, and that painting, how important that painting is.
Can you share what's going to happen in 2024 at the library?
Yes. So 2024 is the 100th anniversary of the Morgan Library becoming a public institution. Victoria and I believe, I'm certainly in real life, Belle spearheaded this. It was really important to her. Up until then, it had been a private collection owned just by the family for the family's use and anyone that they deemed fit. It was very important to Belle that the collection and the structure itself become a public library, which it's like telling someone, just to put it in perspective, do you mind giving away like tens of millions of dollars, right? Because that's how much this collection is worth in the structure, but they did. And Victoria and I do believe, I mean, it's part of our fictional world, but we do believe that it was in some way what Belle wanted her legacy to be. You know, she made a lot of sacrifices to pass. And we kind of believe that the only thing for her that would have been worth it was to leave behind this legacy for every person, right? Because it is now a public institution. So they're going to celebrate this. And one of the things that they're going to do as part of their celebration is to focus on Belle, really unearth her and her contributions and her role, and shine the light on it at the Morgan itself. And as part of that, I mean, there's going to be displays. I hope they're going to kind of configure her study, her office to be exactly as it was during her lifetime, much like they have JP's study. The other thing they're doing as part of that is they're going to digitize and make available for anybody to see the letters between Belle and Bernard, which was her lover and dear and very close colleague. Those letters are the only existing, from what we know, personal communications of Belle. At the end of her life, she burned all of her correspondence, all of her letters, her journals. We think it's probably because she didn't want people to find out about her identity. Bernard was instructed to burn all those letters, but of course he did not. He lived in a villa in Italy and he kept them in a trunk. And they were available for scholars to look at, but in Italy, but otherwise were not available for looking at. But as part of this project, they're digitizing those letters. The way she wrote these letters to Bernard, they were almost like diary entries. She kept them going day after day. And it's going to be just a fabulous look into her day-to-day life.
It's 4:31, 4:32. We have had a great conversation. Thank you for your transparency and just bringing her life to our attention. And I'm looking forward to going back again and reading more of your books. Thank you to the audience. We've had a large audience with some great questions, and it's been a great time. So I'll let you have the last word before we close out.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you, Garbo. Thank you to this wonderful festival. And thank you to readers everywhere. Victoria and I are just so honored to have the opportunity to tell Belle's story. And thank you for reading it.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.